37 million Americans tuned in that night. Pete Buttigieg leaned forward, smirking, sharp suit, sharp tongue, as J.D. Vance spoke of soldiers no one remembered, forgotten names, forgotten towns, forgotten graves. But then, J.D. did something no one expected. He reached into his coat pocket, and with a calm hand and heavy eyes, he placed a single war medal onto the table. Not just placed, he slammed it. The medal rang out like a gunshot. The room went still. No rebuttal, no clever retort, just silence. That wasn't a political moment. It was a reckoning. That wasn't about polling. It was about pain. Real pain from real people. Who once wore that medal and now sleep beneath a flag that forgot them? This story may not come from transcripts or televised moments, but it rises from a truth many know in their bones. The kind that doesn't need headlines to be heard. Though the characters are imagined, the emotions they carry belong to millions. So ask yourself, how many more medals have we buried with silence? Stay with us, because if we forget stories like this, we forget ourselves. It didn't start with a gavel, it started with a stare. Washington, D.C., the National Security Forum. Broadcast live on 4 major networks. The kind of night where reputations don't just rise or fall, they fracture in real time. Inside the studio, the air felt colder than the cameras made it seem. The desk at center stage gleamed like a museum exhibit. Dark walnut, waxed to a mirror shine. 5 chairs behind it, 5 nameplates, 5 men in navy suits. But the audience knew, everyone knew, only 2 would matter tonight. Pete Buttigieg sat dead center, framed perfectly under the spotlight, calm, composed, almost surgical in his stillness. His posture said preparation, his eyes said performance. The audience leaned into his polish. On the far end, partially outside the perfect symmetry of the camera's frame, sat J.D. Vance. He didn't move, didn't blink much, but that stillness pulled attention like gravity. Leaning slightly forward, hands folded loosely in front of him, J.D. wasn't playing to the room. He wasn't waiting for applause. He looked like someone who had walked into the building already carrying a story and now had to decide whether to tell it. A digital countdown ticked in the corner of every feed. 000019. In the control room, a young technician whispered, "We're live in 10. Then the lights lifted. The moderator's voice, steady and practiced, broke the silence. "Good evening, America. Tonight, 5 voices gather to answer 3 questions. What keeps us safe? What makes us strong? And what could cost us everything if we get it wrong?" The opening round followed the script, almost to the second. Talking points, shared nods, muted disagreements. Pete spoke with ease. J.D. sat in silence, his expression unreadable. Then came question 3. "Senator Vance," the moderator said, "you've consistently opposed expansions to foreign aid and overseas military funding. Some say that makes America weaker on the global stage. Secretary Buttigieg, you've expressed strong disagreement. Would you like to respond?" Pete didn't just respond. He launched. He turned not abruptly but deliberately and locked eyes with J.D. His smile was thin, controlled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'll be direct," Pete said. "Senator Vance's view of national security isn't strategy, it's retreat. Calling it America First is good branding, but let's be honest. What we're seeing here is isolationism dressed up as patriotism, and in the real world, that costs lives." There it was, the first strike. J.D. didn't flinch. He simply looked up. Not in anger, not even in challenge, just with quiet calculation, like a man listening closely for the sound of something cracking beneath the surface. The camera cut wide, capturing them both in frame. One man spoke the language of institutions, the other, the weight of something deeper. Pete continued, leaning forward. "You can't protect a country by pretending the rest of the world doesn't exist," he said. "Real leadership means showing up, not shrinking back." The jab was surgical, smooth, designed to land without ever seeming aggressive. But J.D.'s fingers moved slightly. His right hand, resting by his side, slid toward his blazer. It was subtle, barely visible. But if you watch closely, you could tell he was touching something tucked just inside. No one on that stage knew what it was. The moderator shifted in his seat, ready to move on. But before he could speak, JD's voice, low and measured, cut through the air. I agree, JD said. Leadership is showing up. He paused, looked at Pete. Not through him, into him. But the real question is, showing up where? And for who? It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a hinge. Somewhere behind the cameras, someone exhaled without realizing they'd been holding their breath. And in the control room, a producer muttered just loud enough for the intern beside her to hear. We just left the script. The air in the room didn't break. It tightened. Pete Buttigieg leaned back slightly, confident that he had landed his point with precision. His posture read polished, victorious. The moderator, catching the subtle shift in tone, gave a clipped, courteous smile, not to encourage but to brace. They could feel it too. Something was turning. J.D. Vance didn't rush. He rarely did. He let the silence stretch half a second longer than was comfortable for television. Just long enough for the audience to start wondering, is he rattled or is he building something? Then he spoke. I don't disagree with the idea of showing up, J.D. said, voice steady, almost disarmingly calm. But we ought to ask, where do we show up first? And who do we leave behind when we don't? There was no fire in his tone, but there was something heavier, restraint, like a man holding back not anger, but history, the kind that bruises in silence. Because foreign policy, he continued, without domestic memory, is a hollow empire. The phrase hung there. The cameras didn't cut away, neither did the audience. JD's gaze remained fixed not on Pete, but on the middle distance, not ducking the confrontation, but rising slightly above it. His voice didn't rise. It settled like dust in an empty room. Across the country in living rooms and phones and earbuds, people leaned closer. They didn't know it yet, but they were hearing the sentence that would be replayed over and over the next morning, in headlines, on talk shows, across diner counters and Facebook comment threads. Foreign policy without domestic memory is a hollow empire. The moderator, professional but no longer neutral, gave a thin-lipped smile. That line would be clipped before the next ad break. JD hadn't just answered. He had reframed the question. Pete blinked once, not in panic, but in recalibration. He hadn't expected something that quiet to cut that deep. JD sat still. His right hand remained loosely curled under the desk, fingertips grazing the inner seam of his blazer. The weight inside his pocket wasn't large, but it was dense, real, metal. His thumb brushed the edge of it, as if grounding himself with something no one else in the room could see. It wasn't time for it yet, but it was close. I understand the argument, JD said, now turning to Pete for the first time since the exchange began, that if we don't lead the world, someone else will. I've read the briefings, I've sat in those rooms. But let me tell you something, those briefings never include. They don't mention the names of the people whose factories closed while those deals were signed. They don't mention the kids in my home state who enlisted at 18 because it was that, or opioids. And they definitely don't mention the names of veterans who died waiting on the VA to return a call. He paused. People like David Klein. The name came and went before anyone could ask who he was. JD didn't explain, not yet, just dropped the name into the air like a breadcrumb. The moderator, sensing the shift again, gently redirected. Senator, are you saying that supporting our allies abroad comes at the direct expense of Americans at home? JD didn't flinch. I'm saying that if we don't remember the people we built this country for, we'll wake up one day and realize we've built it without them. He said it without anger, without volume, but with a kind of stillness that felt louder than the applause it refused to ask for. The room didn't applaud, but it didn't move either. Somewhere in the shadows of the control booth, a network executive wrote one line on a yellow pad and underlined it twice. David Klein. Who is he? And just like that, a name had entered the bloodstream of the nation. The name hung in the air like smoke. David Klein. The audience didn't recognize it. Neither did the moderators, the panelists, or the millions watching at home. But JD did. He'd heard that name less than 24 hours earlier, alone in his Senate office, long after the lights outside the Capitol dome had gone dark. The envelope had arrived without ceremony. No staffer announcement, no courier knock, just resting quietly on the corner of his desk as if it had always been there. Plain, unmarked, except for a single line in looping handwriting. From Maggie R., VA nurse, Dayton, Ohio. He opened it without expecting much. What fell out was heavier than paper. A small object wrapped in gauze slid into his palm. Beneath it, a note. Brief, handwritten, and shaky in a way that suggested the writer had paused more than once. The message read, "He died under a bridge, but he once wore this with pride." That was all. No backstory, no politics, no request. Just truth, laid bare. JD unfolded the gauze slowly and saw it. A bronze star medal. Its surface was scratched, its ribbon worn at the edges. Not pristine, but earned. The kind of metal that doesn't sit in a display case, but is thrown in a drawer after the war, because the person who received it never believed they needed a reminder of what they already carried inside. JD didn't move for several minutes. He sat there turning the metal over in his hand, thumb brushing the cold edges as if feeling the weight of the silence that followed a man like David Klein into the grave. He didn't need to Google the name. He knew the type. He had met dozens like him back home. Men with old boots, quiet eyes, and stories they never told. Men who had once stood tall in a uniform, but who now sat slumped on park benches with no one looking them in the eye. He reread the note. He died under a bridge. JD could see it. January cold, snow packed against concrete, and the rest of the world moving on, faster and brighter and louder, like it always did. He looked down at the metal again. His fingers curled around it slowly. Then he stood, walked to his coat rack, and slipped the metal into the inner pocket of his blazer. Not with ceremony, not with intent. Just quietly, like something worth carrying, even if he didn't yet know why. That morning, as he dressed for the debate, he reached into the pocket and felt it again. He left it there. He hadn't planned to say David's name on stage, hadn't planned to bring up the medal, but now sitting under the blinding lights with Pete talking about global credibility and leading with strength, JD could feel the shape of it through the fabric, cool and unmoving against his ribs, like a question he hadn't yet answered. He didn't know if tonight was the moment, but he knew the moment was coming, and when it did, he wouldn't have to explain it. He'd just have to show it. Long before his name echoed through the studio, David Klein had already disappeared. Not suddenly, not violently, just slowly, one unnoticed day at a time. He had lived in the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, in a one-bedroom apartment behind an old auto parts store that had gone out of business the year before. Vietnam veteran, 2 tours, Bronze Star, honorably discharged. He never talked much about it. The neighbors only knew because a VA nurse sometimes dropped off groceries, and the landlord once saw a faded military photo tucked behind a cracked frame on his nightstand. He wasn't homeless, at least not at first. He worked. For years, he held a job at a metal stamping plant on the south side, then at a textile mill 2 towns over, then at a warehouse. He was the kind of man who never called in sick, didn't ask questions, and brought a thermos of black coffee to every shift. Until one day the line stopped running, the orders stopped coming, and the jobs went with them. He tried to stay afloat, applied for VA disability, twice, denied, not enough documentation. No direct combat injury on file. He reapplied with the help of a nurse who believed him. Denied again. No appeal, no phone call. Just a letter with boxes and language that read like a system talking to itself. He sold his truck, then his furniture. Eventually, he stopped calling friends, though no one could say exactly when. He became the man people nodded to on the street but never asked how he was doing. The man who once stood tall at a base in Da Nang now walked with a limp no one cared to ask about. The man who once fired cover rounds for men he never saw again now watched daytime television in a laundromat to stay warm. On the night he died, it had dropped to 18 degrees. He had refused the shelter bed offered to him the week before. Told the nurse he didn't like the noise, that he'd be fine. He wasn't drunk, he wasn't high. He just laid down beneath a concrete overpass and didn't get back up. By morning, his body was stiff, tucked into a military-style sleeping position, with his hands folded across his chest like he had braced himself for the cold the only way he knew how. No family claimed him. There was no obituary, no flag-folding ceremony, no last roll call, just a coroner's note, a case file, and a small cardboard box with his name misspelled on the side. It was the VA nurse who kept the medal. She found it in his coat pocket, along with a dog tag he never wore but always carried. She didn't frame it, didn't clean it, just wrapped it in gauze and held on to it for a week before writing the letter. She didn't send it to the VA or the local news. She sent it to the one man she had heard speak once on TV, a senator who, unlike the others, hadn't sounded like he'd already forgotten people like David. She didn't ask for help. She didn't ask for justice. She just wanted someone to remember, someone with a voice loud enough that maybe the silence around David Klein's life wouldn't be the only thing he left behind. And when J.D. Vance opened that envelope and read those words, he died under a bridge. But he once wore this with pride. It wasn't a policy brief. It wasn't a campaign talking point. It was a handoff. One man's story passed into the pocket of another, waiting for the moment it would finally be heard. It was a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind Washington specializes in. Low clouds, no sun, just a dull silver cast over the Capitol dome, like a sheet pulled tight. J.D. had just returned from a committee hearing when the knock came on his office door. Not the usual staff tap and peek, not the practiced rhythm of a reporter, but a deliberate knock. 2 knuckles, solid, final. His aide opened it halfway and turned back to J.D. with a look that said, "I think you'll want to take this." The man who stepped into the room didn't look like he'd ever been to a Senate office before. Worn jeans, flannel shirt, calloused hands. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. His eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on J.D. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," the man said, voice low but steady. "I'm David Klein's brother." J.D. stood. Something in the room shifted. Not in volume, in gravity. The man didn't sit right away. He pulled a folded envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and set it gently on the desk. J.D. didn't touch it yet. He waited. "My brother didn't talk much," the man said. "Especially not about the war. But I'll tell you this. He watched the hearings. He watched your speeches. He said—" The man paused, eyes flicking to the side, voice tightening just slightly. He said, "This guy remembers people like me." J.D. didn't respond. He just listened. That seemed to be what the man needed. "We lost touch for a while," the brother continued. "I guess that's on me. You get busy with life, with family. But I checked on him a few months back. Brought him a coat. Didn't know he was sleeping out there. He never said." The man swallowed something that didn't quite go down. "And then one day, I got a call from the nurse. Said they found him under the overpass, and that he'd had this." He gestured toward the envelope on the desk. J.D. opened it carefully. Inside was the medal, the same bronze star, worn, scratched, silent, the same weight that had been in his pocket the night before. J.D. picked it up slowly, held it between his thumb and forefinger, the way you might hold something you didn't yet feel worthy of. "I don't know what to do with it," the brother said. "I thought about keeping it, but I kept thinking about what he said, about you." He looked at J.D. directly now, not as a senator, as a man. "So I figured, maybe it doesn't belong on a shelf. Maybe it's not supposed to sit in a drawer or hang in a hallway somewhere nobody ever sees it. Maybe it's supposed to mean something. Still." He didn't cry. He didn't ask for anything. He just stepped back from the desk and left the medal lying there. The last part he said so softly J.D. almost missed it. "Do something with it." That was it. No ceremony, no handshake. The man turned and walked out the way he came. Boots quiet on the carpet, the kind of goodbye that felt less like an exit and more like a handoff. J.D. sat for a long time after the door closed. The office around him hummed with distant activity, keyboards, muted hallway conversations. But it all faded behind the weight of the thing now resting in front of him. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't even about memory anymore. It was about the responsibility that comes with being the last one to hold the story. And this one had a name, a face, and a medal too heavy to ignore. The medal sat on the desk like a question no one wanted to answer. JD had called a quick meeting late that afternoon. His core team gathered in his private office. 4 people who knew him well enough not to be intimidated by silence, but still sensed the gravity of what was about to be shared. No one touched their coffee. Phones stayed face down. JD stood behind his desk and, without saying much, unwrapped the small bundle of cloth and placed the bronze star in the center of the table. The room stilled. It was smaller than they expected, worn, unpolished, the ribbon frayed at the edges. A medal that had seen time, travel, weather, maybe war. JD didn't offer a long explanation. He didn't need to. His name was David Klein, he said. Vietnam vet. Died alone under a bridge. No family claimed him. His brother gave this to me and said, "Do something with it." No one responded right away. One staffer, Elise, the communications advisor, cleared her throat gently. "Senator," she began, choosing her words with care, "I understand the meaning. I do. But we're walking into a televised debate watched by half the country. If you pull that out, it's going to become the story, and not in the way you want." JD didn't interrupt. He just watched her, quietly. She continued, "It's too raw. It'll look like a stunt, like we planned it. That's how they'll spin it. Headlines won't say Vance honors a fallen veteran. They'll say, Senator stages emotional prop moment. You know how this works." Another aide chimed in. "If you bring it out, you lose control of the narrative. It'll overshadow everything else you say." JD nodded slowly. He appreciated their candor. That's why he kept them close. But he could feel it in his chest. Not stubbornness, not defiance. Something deeper. The quiet insistence of a truth that refused to wait its turn. He walked around the desk and picked the medal up again, letting it rest in his hand. The weight wasn't much, a few ounces at most. But in that moment, it felt heavier than any policy binder they'd reviewed that week. He turned it over once, then again, his thumb brushing the scratches like they were braille. "I didn't ask you here to get permission," he said calmly. "I just wanted you to see it. Because whether I mention his name or not, this medal is coming with me." There was no grand declaration, no speech, just a quiet decision, delivered with the kind of stillness that usually means something is already set in motion. He slipped the medal into the inside pocket of his blazer and buttoned it shut. Elise exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in understanding. She nodded once and stood, followed by the others. As they left the room, JD remained behind for a few more seconds. He looked out the window at the city preparing for night. Lights flickered on across buildings built on promises. Somewhere in that city, someone else was being forgotten. Somewhere else, another name was being erased. But not David Klein. Not tonight. JD turned from the window and walked toward the exit. The debate was in 2 hours. The speech might shift. The questions might change. But the weight in his pocket, that was fixed. And this time, he wasn't walking in empty-handed. The lights hadn't changed, but the room felt different now. Back at the National Security Forum, the camera panned slowly across the panelists. 4 men sat upright, attentive, alert, but only 2 were under real pressure. JD Vance hadn't spoken in several minutes, but the audience hadn't stopped watching him. There was something coiled in his silence now, something just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Pete Buttigieg adjusted his microphone, offered a quick, practiced smile to the crowd, and waited for his turn. His posture hadn't shifted since the debate began. Hands folded neatly, chin slightly lifted, expression polished enough to seem unscripted. The moderator glanced at his next card, then back up, eyes scanning the line of panelists. His grip on the stack tightened slightly. He knew what question was coming, and more importantly, he knew what it would do. "Secretary Buttigieg," he said evenly, "you've expressed concern about Senator Vance's foreign policy stance. Would you care to clarify?" Pete didn't blink. This was the cue he'd been waiting for. He turned slowly toward JD. The movement wasn't sharp or aggressive. It was intentional. The kind of turn that says, "I'm not addressing the moderator anymore. I'm talking to you." JD looked back, calm, composed, no flicker of emotion. Pete's smile didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened. "Senator Vance," he began, "you once said we should fix home before fixing others." He paused just long enough for the audience to settle in, then delivered the line with surgical precision. "That's not patriotism. That's cowardice." The words landed like a stone tossed into still water. Not explosive, but deep. The audience murmured. Not gasps, but shifts. A slight rustle of suits. The clink of a pen dropped onto a table. In the control booth, one technician raised her eyebrows and leaned forward. The moderator didn't speak. He simply glanced down, then up again, and subtly squared the cards in his hand, like a man preparing for something to slip off balance. Pete pressed on, voice calm, measured but unmistakably pointed. "We don't lead the world by retreating into ourselves. We don't secure our future by ignoring our role in the present. There are soldiers overseas tonight who depend on American leadership. There are nations on the brink that look to our example. Saying we should fix home first is a comforting slogan, but it's not a strategy, it's an excuse to stay small." He leaned back ever so slightly, resting his hands again, gaze steady. Across the country, televisions flickered in living rooms and restaurants, phones buzzed in pockets, and people shifted forward. Not because the volume had risen, but because the tone had changed. Pete had drawn the first line, and he had drawn it in ink. JD remained still. His right hand, once again, touched the inside of his blazer, fingertips brushing the weight he had carried there all day. His face didn't twitch. His breathing didn't change. But the camera caught something else. His eyes, they didn't narrow. They didn't harden. They deepened, as if pulling from a place Pete hadn't seen, as if reaching for a memory that didn't need a podium to exist. The moderator gave a subtle nod, prepared to turn the floor over, but then hesitated, just enough to let the silence linger. And in that moment, in that pause before JD responded, something shifted beyond the studio. Viewers watching at home could feel it. This wasn't just about competing visions. This was about what happens when one man accuses another of cowardice on national television, and the other has a medal in his pocket that proves he's not the one hiding. JD didn't speak yet, but when he did, no one would look away. JD didn't answer right away. He stared at the table in front of him, the reflection of studio lights blurring across the polished wood like water disturbed by wind. Around him, the other panelists sat waiting, some respectfully, others watching like spectators unsure whether to lean in or look away. But JD wasn't thinking about them. He wasn't thinking about the camera or the headlines or even Pete's words. He was thinking about weight, the kind that doesn't come from numbers or policy or polling, the kind you feel through fabric, the kind that rests over your heart and says, "This matters, whether anyone sees it or not." His right hand drifted toward the inside of his blazer, fingers curling around the edge of the metal. He didn't take it out. Not yet. He just let it sit in his palm, cold and still, the ribbon slightly frayed, the metal scratched but intact. He let the weight settle into his skin, into his breath, into his memory. His mind slipped back to the nurse's letter. Not the first line, not the one everyone remembered. He died under a bridge. But he once wore this with pride. No, it was the second page, the one written shakier, slower, the one she probably debated including at all. He waited 9 hours at the VA once. Then he stopped going. I asked him why. He said it wasn't the wait that hurt. It was feeling like no one noticed he was waiting. JD hadn't read that part out loud, not to his staff, not even to the brother. But now, seated under hot lights with the word cowardice still echoing in the corners of the room, that sentence pressed harder than ever. It was absurd, he thought, how pain could sit quietly in someone's life for years, unnoticed, unmentioned, and then crash through a room full of suits and cameras without making a sound. He looked up briefly. Pete had shifted slightly in his chair, perhaps thinking JD wouldn't respond, perhaps thinking he'd struck the final note, but JD didn't meet his eyes. Not yet. He looked down again, the tips of his fingers still curled around the metal, and whispered to himself, not for the microphone, not for the moment, just for the man he couldn't bring back. This isn't about me. And it wasn't. It never had been. The policies, the speeches, The arguments, they were scaffolding. What mattered wasn't the debate, it was the silence it disguised. The absence that men like David Klein had slipped into when the world stopped asking how they were doing. JD hadn't planned to say his name. He hadn't planned to make this personal. But how do you stay quiet when the story you're carrying belongs to someone who never got the chance to tell it? He looked across the table again, not at Pete this time, but at the moderator. There was a faint nod. JD didn't need the cue. He was ready now. The moment was no longer a choice. It had become a responsibility. The kind that doesn't come from strategy. The kind that comes from weight. Real weight. The kind you carry not for show, but because someone else no longer can. In his mind, he pictured the cardboard box the nurse had described. No ceremony, no flag. Just a man's life reduced to a folded coat, a crumpled letter, and a medal in the pocket of someone who didn't want the world to forget. JD sat up straighter, hands still resting over his heart, the medal beneath his jacket, no longer just an object. Now it was an answer. Pete was mid-sentence, voice rising again. And that's exactly why disengagement is dangerous, why we can't pretend the world stops at our border. JD moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise a finger, but his hand left his chest, opened his blazer, and reached slowly, deliberately into the inner pocket. The motion was quiet, almost reverent. The audience didn't register it at first. The cameras did. A small clink followed, subtle but sharp. JD had placed something on the table. Pete stopped. His sentence hung unfinished in the air, like a breath never released. The moderator looked down. So did the rest of the panelists. There, on the gleaming surface of the table between the name placards and half-empty water glasses, lay a bronze star medal. Faintly worn, dulled with time, the ribbon neatly folded beneath. The spotlights caught it, reflected a quiet glint. It looked small, but it pulled the room toward it like gravity. JD didn't explain right away. He let the silence stretch. Let the medal speak first. Then after a beat so long it felt like a pause in history, he looked directly at Pete. Not with anger, not even defiance, but with the calm weight of someone who had carried the truth longer than he wanted to. This belonged to David Klein, JD said, voice even. He didn't check his notes, didn't glance at the moderator. He didn't have to. He served 2 tours in Vietnam, came back with this medal and chronic back pain. He worked in factories until they closed, applied for disability 3 times, denied every time. The panel was silent. JD's eyes didn't waver. He died under a bridge last winter. No press, no service, no headline, just a nurse who still remembered his name and sent this to me because she said no one else would. He glanced briefly at the medal again. She wrote, "He once wore this with pride." A quiet rustle moved through the room. Even in a space designed for political theater, something felt different now. The kind of different you don't script, you witness. JD turned slightly toward the audience, but his voice stayed steady, unadorned. We've sent over $50 billion overseas in the last 18 months. I'm not here to debate that math. I'm here to remind you what we didn't send. He nodded toward the medal. We didn't send a blanket. We didn't send a counselor. We didn't send anyone to check if a Bronze Star veteran was sleeping under a bridge in Dayton, Ohio. Pete shifted slightly, lips parted, but no words came. JD leaned back. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. I'm not anti-globalist, he said finally, quieter now. I just believe patriotism starts with memory, and we've forgotten too many names. The moderator still hadn't spoken. Neither had the panelists. Only the medal sat on the table now. The smallest thing in the room, and somehow the loudest. The studio lights hummed. A low, ambient murmur of blinking indicator panels, shifting camera rigs, and distant feeds kept ticking forward. But inside the forum, it was as if someone had slammed the brakes on time. Pete Buttigieg's mouth was still half open. But no words came. His eyes flickered once, toward the medal, then away, then back again. He wasn't alone. The entire panel sat stiff. One woman's hand hovered near her pen but didn't move. The moderator's fingers were white around the stack of question cards, but none were turned. JD Vance remained still, shoulders square, voice steady. We ask men like David Klein to bleed, he said, and then we tell them to wait. Wait in lines. Wait for paperwork. Wait until the war inside them turns silent. He paused. Not for drama, for truth. He didn't make it. Still no reply. Just the soft, mechanical snap of camera shutters, like distant rainfall. And the blinking red lights above the cameras that meant millions of people were watching. At home, in silence. Pete's jaw tightened. His spine straightened, but he didn't interrupt. For once, there was nothing to counter, because JD hadn't thrown a punch. He told a story, and the room knew it. The moderator tried to clear their throat, but gave up. Instead, they gestured vaguely toward JD, as if to offer the floor that had already been claimed without asking. JD didn't rise. He didn't need to. He let his hand rest near the metal on the table, not touching it, just near enough to protect it, like a name in a prayer. You don't have to agree with me on foreign policy, he continued, but don't tell me that remembering people like David makes me less of a patriot. Because if patriotism means only showing up for the photo ops, then we've built a flag that only waves in front of cameras, not across bridges where our veterans die cold. The panelists shifted. One crossed her arms, another looked down. But still, no one spoke. It was the weight of the reel that had entered the room. Not a soundbite, not a pivot. Just a moment too raw to argue with. JD's voice softened now. The nurse who sent this medal didn't ask for airtime. She didn't want revenge. She just asked if anyone remembered him. That's what this is, not a stunt. A memory, a beat. Then another. Somewhere, a producer whispered something frantically into a headset. A cue missed. A schedule broken. The broadcast had gone off script. And for the first time that evening, no one wanted to bring it back. Pete glanced sideways again. The smooth cadence, the practiced rhythm he was known for, all gone. His hands folded tightly in front of him, knuckles pale. There was no rebuttal ready. JD didn't look at him anymore. He looked out. To the families watching, the ones who never got a folded flag or a phone call or a grave marker with enough letters. I didn't bring this medal to win a debate, he said. I brought it so we wouldn't keep losing people quietly. And then, finally, silence again. But this time it wasn't the stunned silence of a frozen room. It was something closer to reverence. Even the moderator waited before finally speaking. Let's take a break, they said, voice cracking slightly. We'll return in a moment. But everyone knew the debate had already changed. Not ended, but changed. Because now there was a medal on the table, and no one could pretend it wasn't there. As the silence in the forum lingered like a held breath, the outside world exhaled in a roar. What happened in that room didn't stay there. It detonated across the nation, one screen at a time. The moment J.D. Vance stepped off the stage, it was no longer just a forum, it was a flashpoint. Newsrooms across the country scrambled to get the clip up before their competitors. Within 15 minutes, 3 major networks had aired the moment in full. JD interrupting mid-debate, reaching into his blazer, and placing a worn Bronze Star medal onto the polished oak table. No theatrics, no yelling, just silence, and a story that needed no amplification. By the time he left the building, #medal-on-the-table had started trending on Twitter. First in Washington, then in Ohio, and by dusk, it was the #1 topic nationwide. Screenshots flooded the internet. One photo caught the medal under the soft glow of the studio lighting. Its ribbon slightly frayed, its surface nicked and aged. JD's hand lingered just above it, as if letting go of something far heavier than metal. Captions erupted like wildfire. One medal silenced the room. That wasn't a political move. That was a reckoning. He brought David Klein back to the table. Veterans began speaking up, not politicians, not influencers, just men and women who had spent years in silence. Photos appeared of medals in drawers, dog tags hung beside unpaid medical bills, and VA appointment letters months overdue. A Vietnam vet from Tennessee tweeted, JD wasn't performing. That look in his eyes? That was memory speaking. Another wrote simply, I waited 2 years for a hip replacement. JD didn't lie. More hashtags emerged organically. Hashtag fix home first, hashtag remember David Klein, and hashtag we wait too long. A quiet movement was taking shape. Not angry, but tired. Tired of being invisible. At the same time, Pete Buttigieg's team was in crisis mode. Reporters flooded their inboxes. Veterans groups issued statements demanding clarification. Donors grew uneasy. Within the hour, Pete's communications director issued a prepared response. Secretary Buttigieg deeply respects all veterans and remains committed to improving care through bipartisan action. But no one was listening to statements. On television, anchors replayed the footage on loop. Some praised JD's composure. Others questioned the timing, but all agreed on one thing: the moment had changed the conversation. On a local Iowa station, a retired Marine named Arlen Mitchell was interviewed in his living room. With the American flag behind him and his hands trembling slightly, he said, "That medal didn't need an explanation. JD could have said nothing and still said more than most of DC has in decades." Even apolitical viewers found themselves sharing the video. It didn't matter where you stood, left, right, center. Everyone recognized something true in that moment. And behind the scenes, in digital war rooms and media briefings, staffers began rewriting memos. JD hadn't just won a debate, he had reframed the battlefield. Not by fighting louder, but by speaking from a place the country had forgotten. The quiet loyalty of those who served and were left behind. It was no longer a policy disagreement, it was a human one. And it had just begun. It started with a photo, just a wrinkled envelope held between trembling fingers. The nurse from Dayton posted it quietly, without hashtags, without commentary. "This was the last thing David Klein ever gave anyone," she wrote. "Senator Vance didn't ask for it. He just listened." Within hours, the internet caught fire. The full letter, once a private testament of pain, now spread like a match in dry timber. Over 2 million shares in 2 days. The title of the post? "The medal on the table wasn't just metal." Cable shows replayed JD's moment from every angle. Podcasts unpacked each line of David's words. One host choked up reading, "He died under a bridge, but he once wore this with pride." Conservative hosts, liberal hosts, veterans roundtables. The story didn't follow party lines, it pierced them. On talk radio, one caller said, "My brother was David Klein, not in name, but in fate. Same war, same silence." Another whispered, "I got this same medal, and I've felt like throwing it in the river more times than I can count." In kitchens across America, families pulled old boxes from attics, flag cases, discharge papers, photos of men too young for war and too old when they came home. The story of one forgotten veteran had become a mirror, a collective memory that America had long buried beneath bureaucracy and bandwidth. In one particularly moving post, a young Marine in Kansas wrote, "I've waited 2 years for a hip replacement. I fought in Kandahar. I came back to a country with broken systems and perfect slogans." JD didn't lie. He remembered. The White House offered no comment. Pete Buttigieg's team released a short statement. "Every veteran's life deserves dignity. We continue working on reforms." But the damage had been done. Late that night, JD sat alone in his office, scrolling not through headlines but through the comments under the nurse's post. He didn't like or reply to anything, just read, quietly. His fingers rested on the edge of the medal once more. No longer a symbol of one man's tragedy, but of many. Just as the country began to rally behind a forgotten name, the blow came. It was mid-morning when the headlines shifted. A grainy mugshot surfaced. David Klein, 1983, arrested for public intoxication outside a steelworkers bar in Akron. He looked worn, his uniform long replaced by a faded flannel and sunken eyes. Within minutes, opposition media had the image plastered across every screen. "This man wasn't a hero," one commentator declared. "He was a drunk with a record. Is this who we're holding up now?" The backlash spread with the precision of a political machine. Think tanks issued pressers questioning JD's judgment. Anonymous sources whispered that Vance had weaponized emotion, that he had chosen a symbol too broken to bear the weight. On social media, the narrative began to shift. Some commenters parroted the talking points. Veterans deserve respect, but not all of them are saints. Inside JD's office, the atmosphere was tense. Aides debated next moves, advisors urged distance. "We can pivot," one suggested. "Refocus on policy. Don't make this about one man's flaws." But JD didn't speak. He simply stared at the photograph of the medal, then at the viral image of the mugshot. Two versions of David, decorated and damned, now locked in battle in the public arena. Later that day, JD stood at a podium outside the Capitol. No fanfare, no flags, just a small group of reporters, their lenses fixed like crosshairs. His voice was calm, resolute. "You want the truth?" David Klein struggled, like millions of others who came home with nothing but pain and a folded flag. He drank, he fell, he got back up. That doesn't erase his service, that defines it. He paused, eyes steady. Flawed men built this country. They laid the railroads with shaking hands. They stormed beaches with fear in their hearts. We don't honor them because they were perfect. We honor them because they didn't quit. The words struck deeper than any soundbite. A silence followed, not awkward, but heavy with thought. In the background, a few veterans watching the live stream from a VFW hall in Indiana stood and saluted. They didn't speak either. They just knew. By evening, the tide began to shift again. The hashtag flawed but fought started trending. Stories poured in, of grandfathers with pasts, of mothers who wore medals and bore scars, of families who had been told for decades that sacrifice only counted if it was spotless. On a late-night show, one veteran summed it up best. "We all got our mugshots. Maybe not on paper, but in memory, in shame, in silence." JD didn't just defend David, he defended the rest of us still trying to stand tall. Back in his office, JD received a text from David Klein's brother. 4 words. "You did it right." The office was dark except for the glow of a single desk lamp. The chaos outside had dimmed into whispers, headlines replaced by silence. JD sat alone, the noise of the day finally quiet. No staff, no cameras, just him and the screen. He replayed the clip from the forum, again and again. The frame paused on the moment he laid the medal on the table, his hands steady, the room stunned. The bronze star shimmered slightly under the studio lights, too small for the weight it now carried. He watched Pete's face freeze mid-word. He watched the moderator blink twice. He watched himself and didn't recognize what he saw. He leaned back in his chair, loosened his tie, and finally exhaled. The adrenaline had long faded. Now came the doubt. The medal sat just inches from his fingertips, resting quietly on the mahogany. JD didn't touch it. He just stared, as if it might speak first. Behind him, the Capitol was lit in solemn gold. Outside, somewhere in Middle America, people were talking about David Klein, remembering names they hadn't spoken in years, opening drawers, pulling out old photos, digging through folded flags. But inside this room, there was only one voice, his. He whispered into the stillness, "Did I do the right thing?" He waited for something, an answer, a feeling, a sign. Nothing came. He tried to shrug it off, to lean on logic. The letter had been real. The brother had come, uninvited. The story wasn't manufactured. It was raw, yes. But wasn't that the point? Still, he felt a shadow in his chest. "Or did I just get him mocked again?" he said, more to the silence than to himself. The mugshot was still up on one tab. He'd left it open, almost as punishment. He didn't look away this time. The image wasn't kind. The man in it looked broken, maybe dangerous. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't the man you put on a podium. And yet, JD thought, wasn't that exactly the problem? We only honor people when they fit the narrative, when they're clean, when they look like someone we'd vote for. He closed the laptop softly. Then he stood, walked slowly to the window, and placed a hand on the cool glass. Down below, the city moved on, as if nothing monumental had been said, as if no truth had landed like a stone in water. He turned back to the desk, looked at the medal again. It didn't shimmer this time. It just sat there, quietly heavy, asking him for the same courage it once represented. He didn't cry, but he didn't speak again either. Instead, he sat down, opened a drawer, and pulled out a legal pad. The page stayed blank for a long time. Then slowly he wrote one sentence. Flawed truth is still truth. Morning light filtered through the marble columns of the Senate building, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. JD walked briskly, a stack of folders under one arm, a tight knot of exhaustion still pulling at his temples. The weight of the past 48 hours clung to him like a second skin. Viral headlines, staff briefings, political analysts dissecting his every breath. He didn't notice the woman at first. She stood alone by the elevator bank, holding a small brown leather purse and wearing a lavender coat too thin for DC's early spring wind. Her white hair was pinned neatly, and her frame was small, fragile even, but her posture was straight, proud, unmoving. As JD approached, she turned, meeting his eyes with surprising steadiness. "You're him," she said softly. JD paused, unsure whether to smile, nod, or brace himself. He gave a small, courteous tilt of the head, already reaching for the elevator button. But she reached out first, not forcefully, just gently enough to stop his step. Her hand brushed his arm. It was cold, trembled slightly. "My husband served in Korea," she said. JD's shoulders lowered just a touch. The elevator behind them dinged, then closed again. No one moved. "He never talked about it," she continued, her voice low, private. "Not to me, not to our sons, not even to the VA doctor." She looked away for a moment, her eyes tracing something far beyond the Senate walls. Then she looked back and added, "But yesterday, when you placed that medal on the table," he cried. JD's eyes searched hers, suddenly uncertain of what to say. He had been called reckless, brave, manipulative, and sincere, sometimes all in the same hour, but not this. "He didn't cry when his best friend didn't come home," the woman went on. "He didn't cry when they lost the house, but yesterday he just sat there and cried." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and she gave a short, apologetic laugh, the kind people use to chase away the tremor of too much emotion. JD swallowed hard. "Thank you," he managed to say, barely above a whisper, but she wasn't finished. "I don't know what they'll say about you on the news today," she said, "but in my house, and I think in a lot of houses that don't get quoted on TV, you did the right thing." The elevator dinged again. She smiled gently, gave his arm a small pat, and stepped inside the cab. As the doors began to close, she looked at him one last time and added, "You reminded him that someone still sees him." Then she was gone. JD stood there for a moment, frozen in the hallway. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly from other corridors. But in that quiet corner, it was as if time had slowed just enough to let that moment live a little longer. He turned back toward his office, not with relief, not with pride, but with something steadier. Something like resolve. Whatever the day would bring, the editorials, the polls, the stage rebuttals, it would never erase that woman's voice or her husband's tears. Not everything needed a microphone. Some truths didn't roar. They simply arrived, quiet, honest, and unforgettable. 3 days after the broadcast, JD Vance left Washington without telling the press. No cameras, no staff. Just him, his old truck, and a folded piece of paper with a name that didn't make headlines. David Klein. The road to Dayton stretched wide and quiet beneath a pale Ohio sky. Farmland blurred past in long, flat strips of browns and greens, broken only by rusted silos and the occasional American flag fluttering against the wind. JD kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on his thigh, tapping in a slow, steady rhythm. He wasn't rehearsing a speech. He wasn't here for a photo op. This was something else, something heavier. He pulled off the highway near a forgotten cemetery on the edge of a working-class neighborhood. The iron gate creaked as he pushed it open, gravel crunching underfoot as he made his way down the narrow path lined with overgrown weeds and leaning headstones. No tour guides here, no marble angels, just cracked slabs of stone and memories fading with time. He found it near the back, beneath a sagging oak tree, a bare plot, no flowers, no marker, just earth. JD stood still for a long moment. A breeze moved through the branches overhead, scattering leaves like the breath of a ghost. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bronze plaque wrapped in cloth. Unwrapping it carefully, he knelt down and pressed it into the soil at the head of the grave. Simple, unadorned, but heavy with meaning. It read, David Klein, Vietnam veteran, factory worker, brother. You weren't forgotten, not this time. JD exhaled slowly. No speech, no camera crew, just the sound of birdsong and distant traffic humming at the edge of town. He sat back on his heels and whispered, I didn't know you, but I heard you, and so did they. The sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the rows of nameless stones like a quiet blessing. He remembered what the nurse had written. He died under a bridge, but he once wore this with pride, and how her words had set something in motion no strategy meeting ever could. A single line from a stranger had made the nation pause. JD placed one hand on the ground beside the plaque and closed his eyes. Not in prayer exactly, just in presence. There were things politics couldn't fix, but there were things it could remember, could honor. And maybe that was a kind of fixing too. After a few minutes he stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, looked once more at the plaque, then at the road behind him. The moment wasn't loud, but it mattered. As he walked back toward the gate, a man in a flannel shirt and ball cap passed him, nodding. JD nodded back. The man glanced toward the new plaque, then looked away, but not before his hand briefly touched his chest. JD didn't stop him. Some things didn't need to be said. They just needed to be done. And in that forgotten cemetery on the edge of Dayton, something had been done. Something that, for once, didn't require applause to matter. By dusk, the cemetery was no longer empty. Word had spread, not through news alerts or official channels, but through whispered phone calls, group texts among veterans, and posts on quiet forums where no one argued, only remembered. By the time the sky had turned a shade of burnt orange, a few cars had already pulled up along the fence line. By nightfall, there were dozens. No cameras, no announcements, no politicians, just people. A man in a Marine Corps jacket stepped out of his truck, holding a small candle and a photograph in a wooden frame. His hands trembled slightly, not from age but from weight, the kind that comes with carrying memories for too long. Behind him, a young couple guided an older woman with a walker. She held a folded American flag against her chest as if afraid the wind might take it. At the edge of the cemetery, near the spot where JD had placed the plaque, the earth was still slightly unsettled. The bronze glinted in the moonlight, surrounded now by flickering flames. Some placed flowers, others laid down medals they could no longer keep in drawers. A teenage boy stepped forward, nervous, thin, eyes darting. He lifted a silver trumpet to his lips and played. It wasn't perfect. The notes of taps wavered slightly in the cool night air. But they carried, clear, sorrowful, and full of grace. One by one, people lowered their heads. A veteran in a wheelchair saluted. A woman holding her son's dog tags clutched them tightly to her chest. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, "That's the sound they never got." No one applauded. No one spoke. The silence became sacred. At one point, a man approached JD. He wore a denim jacket with patches from wars 2 generations apart. He didn't introduce himself, just nodded and handed JD a folded piece of paper. On it, a faded black and white photo of 3 young soldiers in the jungle, all smiling. "My father was one of them," the man said. "He made it home, but never made it back. Tonight I feel like maybe a piece of him did." JD didn't answer. He didn't need to, because something bigger than policy or headlines was happening. Not in the news cycle, not on Twitter, but here, among the candles, the quiet, the people who had seen too much and been thanked too little. A woman lit a candle and whispered a name before placing it on the ground. Another handed JD a letter and said, "My brother was David's roommate in '68, said he used to talk about his mom's chili." Small things, gentle, human things. And as the stars began to pierce the sky overhead, the cemetery glowed, not with grandeur, but with grace. Each candle a voice, each voice a memory, each memory a reminder that dignity doesn't always live in parades or sound bites. Sometimes it lives here, in stillness. JD stood a little apart, hands in his pockets, watching it unfold. He didn't speak. He didn't lead. He didn't need to. This moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to them. And it was finally being heard. 3 days after the vigil, the Senate chamber felt colder than usual. Not by temperature, but by tension. The foreign aid bill was set for debate, and everyone knew the margins would be tight. For weeks, the numbers had been called a safe majority. Lobbyists were confident. Leaders spoke of inevitability. The outcome had been predicted, printed, and presumed. Until the room changed. Until a voice no one expected stood and said something that couldn't be ignored. Senator Miriam Albright, a moderate Democrat from Pennsylvania, slowly rose from her seat. She hadn't spoken much in recent months, her votes predictable, her public remarks careful. But now her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the mic in front of her. "I had prepared a different statement," she began, her voice steadier than her fingers. "I was going to vote yes, not because I don't care about the people this bill aims to help overseas. I do, but because I believe this was the cost of leadership." She paused, scanning the room. JD sat motionless across the aisle, unreadable. "But a few nights ago," she continued, "I watched a man I don't often agree with put a medal on a table. Not for drama, not for applause, but because he couldn't keep quiet anymore. And for a moment I stopped thinking like a senator. I remembered my father's hands." She swallowed hard. "He was a steel worker. Came home with burns and broken fingers. Never asked for anything. Never got much either. He served in Korea. Wouldn't talk about it. Just once he showed me a small box with his ribbons. Said, 'These don't buy heat in winter.' Then he put them back in a drawer." She looked down, then back up. "I realize now there are a lot of drawers in this country, full of medals, folded flags, letters never answered. And maybe, just maybe, before we spend billions abroad, we ought to open a few of them first." A rustle moved across the chamber, chairs shifting, papers being set down, phones no longer glowing. "I'm not saying no to the world," Albright said, "but I'm saying not yet, not like this. Not when the people who built the bones of this nation are still waiting to be seen." With that she sat. The silence that followed was longer than anyone expected. On paper, the vote had the numbers, but on the floor, something had cracked. What had seemed inevitable was now uncertain. One senator leaning back in thought, another folding their notes without speaking. Conversations hushed, calculations rewritten. The bill didn't collapse that day, but it stalled. Amendments were suggested, delays requested. The process slowed like a train that had felt something shift under the tracks. Outside, reporters scrambled for new angles. "Shock defection," one headline read. "Medal moment still reverberates," said another. But inside, among the senators, it wasn't about headlines. It was about hands, drawers, fathers, forgotten people who had never set foot in that chamber, but who now finally had their names carried into it, not by lobbyists, but by memory. JD said nothing. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply reached into his pocket again, not for the medal, but for the letter. Folded, worn, still speaking, and not finished yet. The bell rang at 10:15 a.m. in a small public high school just outside Salina, Kansas. It was Thursday, Civics Day for Mr. Emery's junior class. The old TV mounted in the corner of the classroom flickered to life as students filed in with notebooks half open and earbuds still dangling. The lights stayed dim as Mr. Emery clicked the remote and said, "Just watch for a moment." On the screen, the room came alive with the image of the Senate hearing. The broadcast had circulated for days now, but here, far from Washington, it hit differently. Students watched as J.D. Vance placed the medal on the table. Some recognized the name David Klein from headlines. Others didn't, but all of them were quiet. J.D.'s words played, slow and steady. "This belonged to David Klein. He died under a bridge last winter, after 2 Bronze Stars, while this government sent $50 billion overseas." There was no background music, no edits, just raw footage. J.D.'s voice firm, the silence in the hearing room echoing even through the grainy speakers in Mr. Emery's class. Halfway through the clip, a girl in the back of the room shifted in her chair. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My uncle died like that." Her name was Lena. 17. Her father farmed wheat just south of town. Nobody turned to look at her, but the air in the classroom thickened. Mr. Emery, a former Marine himself, caught her gaze for a moment. He nodded, just once. When the clip ended, the classroom stayed still. Mr. Emery walked to the whiteboard. He picked up the black marker, paused for a breath, and then wrote in capital letters, "What is a nation if it forgets its soldiers?" He capped the marker and let the words linger in silence. The hum of the heater filled the room, along with the quiet tap of a pencil against a desk. No one checked their phones. After a minute, he asked, "Can someone tell me what the sentence means to you?" Not just what it says, what it means. A boy near the window spoke up. "It means we're good at remembering wars, but bad at remembering who fought them." Another added, "We only care if they're on a billboard." And then Lena raised her hand. "It means my uncle came back from Iraq. He couldn't sleep, couldn't keep a job. VA took forever. My dad used to bring him food until we stopped finding him at home." No one interrupted. She wiped her nose, then added, "They gave him a folded flag, but we gave him silence for years." Mr. Emery didn't write any of it down. He didn't need to. The room had already absorbed it. Before dismissing class, he turned to the students and said, "What you saw today wasn't about politics. It was about memory. And sometimes memory is louder than policy. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps a nation honest." As the students packed their bags, many paused to glance again at the board. That sentence didn't go away when the next class arrived. He left it there all week. Outside, the Kansas wind rustled the flags around the school's flagpole. The same wind that had carried off more than just soil over the years. It had taken stories, names, people. But now one story, one name, had found its way back. And in a classroom far from the Capitol, it had been heard. The next morning, long before the Capitol buzzed with cameras and calls, J.D. Vance unlocked his office door and stepped into the stillness. No aides, no press. Just the quiet shuffle of his own shoes across the carpet. The air was calm, but inside him, something had shifted. Something he wasn't entirely ready to name. He walked to the far end of his office, to a narrow wall beside the window that overlooked the mall. Until now it had been bare, a blank space most senators filled with portraits, campaign photos, or honorary degrees. J.D. had kept it empty, intentionally. Now it was time. He reached into a small box on his desk. The metal lay cushioned inside, still weighty in his hand. The bronze star shimmered softly beneath the morning light, but he didn't polish it or adjust it for shine. He didn't need it to gleam. He needed it to speak. With slow, careful movements, he mounted the metal inside a modest frame. No spotlight, no velvet backing. Just simple wood and clean glass, locked in place with 2 brass screws. Beneath it, he affixed a single brass plaque. The engraving was plain, but the words were deliberate. "To David Klein, and all those who served without parades." For a long moment, J.D. stood in front of the display in silence. He didn't take a photo, didn't announce it. This wasn't for Twitter, it wasn't for donors. It was for the men and women like David, the ones who gave something permanent and returned to nothing. From the hallway, muffled footsteps approached. A staffer passed his door, paused, and glanced inside. She said nothing, just nodded. Later that day, a visiting mayor from Kentucky spotted the frame and stopped mid-sentence in J.D.'s office. He read the plaque, looked at J.D., then simply said, "Thank you." The frame didn't sparkle, it didn't dominate the room, but people noticed, and they asked. Slowly, word spread, not through headlines, but through hallway conversations, quiet acknowledgments, second glances. One visiting intern from Montana stared at it for nearly a full minute before whispering, "That's my dad's medal too." Kind of. The display became more than a tribute. It became a quiet altar, one that reminded those who passed through that policy wasn't made only of polls and charts, but of lives, of bodies and burdens, of men who had no lobbyists. J.D. never gave a formal statement about the display. When asked by a reporter weeks later, he simply said, "I didn't put it there to be seen. I put it there so I'd remember what not to ignore." And so it stayed, quietly, proudly, unmoving behind glass. Even when the news cycle changed, even when the forum debates faded and the hashtags cooled, that frame never blurred. It waited silently each day for the next person who would stop, read, and realize that someone had been there, and someone finally cared enough not to walk past. As the day wound down, a quiet hush settled over Capitol Hill. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting a golden hue across the white columns and long marble steps. Inside Senator J.D. Vance's office, everything remained still. But something lingered in the air, something deeper than silence. The glass-encased metal on the wall caught the fading light, its surface muted but resolute. J.D. sat alone at his desk, staring at a stack of letters he hadn't yet read. Some were from voters, others were from veterans. A few had no return address. He didn't reach for them. Instead, his thoughts drifted, not to legislation or talking points, but to a single man, a name once buried beneath bureaucracy. David Klein. It hadn't been about the debate stage or winning the last word. It was never about silencing Pete Buttigieg or scoring political points. It had always been about one thing, saying David's name out loud, just once, so others like him wouldn't vanish without echo. As the halls outside bustled again with aides and evening chatter, a young man in uniform walked past JD's door. He paused. Something caught his eye. He stepped back, leaned in slightly, and saw the metal behind the glass. He read the plaque, then looked around the room through the glass pane. No cameras, no audience, just the weight of meaning. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "I'm still here." And with that, he moved on, steadier than before. This story reminds us that dignity isn't granted by rank, medals, or speeches. It's found in being remembered. J.D. Vance didn't just speak for David Klein. He spoke for thousands like him, whose stories rarely reach the spotlight. It's a quiet kind of courage to carry a name that history might forget and give it meaning again. What about you? Who's the David Klein in your life that deserves to be remembered? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.